button. And just a note, if you're used to these types of presentations being in webinar format, this is in a meeting format. And so you do need to keep your mics muted. I can go in and mute you for everyone's benefit, but you will be able to unmute and turn on your camera if you like, and everyone will be able to see and hear you if that's what you want to have happen. So welcome everyone. My name is Amy Bergquist. I am an Associate Program Director with the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. I'm also a Vice President of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and this training is about doing reporting to the United Nations treaty bodies on death penalty issues, which is something we do in collaboration with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and its members. We have a lot to cover today, so I am going to jump right into our agenda. I'll give a brief overview of UN human rights mechanisms, then I'll give more of a deep dive into the treaty-based mechanisms, which is what all of your projects are focusing on. And then we'll talk about some general principles in terms of doing these types of reports, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. First, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Advocates for Human Rights, we're a non-governmental organization based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. And we work to implement international human rights standards to promote civil society and reinforce the rule of law. And we long ago took a position in opposition to the death penalty under any circumstances. So this is a very important piece of our work. We have special consultative status with the United Nations. And one of the things that means is that we get a bit more access to the United Nations than some of our partner organizations who don't have that status. And we leverage that status to enable them, for example, to take the floor of the Human Rights Council, to get access to delegates to the Human Rights Council, and some other sort of privileges of this consultative status that we have. So it's a way that we can amplify the voices of our partners in our efforts to promote human rights, including working toward abolition of the death penalty. A lot of our partners on the ground and our own experience here in the United States is that these international human rights mechanisms, including at the United Nations, are a way to press for change in individual countries. A lot of our partner organizations say that they feel like their governments don't really listen to them when they express their concerns about human rights issues, when they say this law needs to be changed or these practices need to be changed. But the international human rights mechanism is a way for them to get their voices heard by leveraging the United Nations to put pressure on their governments to change. And in some cases, that pressure can be very effective. A brief overview of UN human rights mechanisms, because what we're talking about today is just one piece of the overall puzzle. We are focusing today on treaty monitoring bodies, but there's also the Human Rights Council, which does the Universal Periodic Review, which is another type of reporting we do. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is more of the administrative body for the United Nations human rights work. And then there are regional human rights bodies as well. You may have heard of the European Court of Human Rights or the African Commission and Court on Human and People's Rights, for example. So this is just one piece of a larger international human rights system. So treaty-based mechanisms that we're going to talk about today are all based on human rights treaties, and there are 9 core human rights treaties. The ones that are in bright green are the ones that you all will be working on. So you'll be engaged working on one of the 4 treaties that are highlighted, but do keep in mind that there are other human rights treaties that we do advocacy on a regular basis that are out there. And so it's good for you to know that there's this larger universe of human rights treaties as well. These treaty-based mechanisms that we're going to talk about don't apply unless the country has opted in, unless the country has ratified the treaty that we're talking about. So if we go back and talk about women, the International Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is a treaty that all but a handful of countries have ratified. The United States has not ratified that treaty. And so because the United States hasn't ratified that particular treaty, then that treaty basically, in lawyer speak, doesn't have jurisdiction over the United States because we haven't ratified that treaty. But other countries have, most countries have. And so if a country has ratified the treaty, then basically they're opting into what the treaty entails. And the treaty includes establishing a committee of experts, a treaty monitoring body of independent experts who interpret the treaty and sort of say what that treaty means. And they can also say whether a country is violating its obligations under the treaty. These committees have regional geographic representation as well. And the photo you see on the right is of the Palais Wilson in Geneva, where most of the treaty bodies meet. And we'll talk a little bit later about what they do when they meet. I do want to pause right now and mention that if you are interested in getting CLE, continuing legal education credit, we've applied for that credit here in Minnesota. We don't have the ability to apply for that credit in other states or jurisdictions, but sometimes states will recognize that credit. If you would like to be counted as present for purposes of CLE credit, can you please just type your name in the chat, and then we'll have that preserved in the chat as our way of taking attendance. We're required to take attendance for CLE credit purposes, and that's probably the easiest way. So just remember to put your name in the chat if you're interested in getting credit, even if it's not from Minnesota, but from another state, you think your state may recognize it. Just make sure that your name is in the chat. You can feel free to say hello as well, to let us know that that you are in attendance, and that will be part of the recording that we'll save. So we'll have a record of that. Sorry for that interruption. So these treaty-based mechanisms that I referenced that are created by the particular human rights treaties have a lot of different functions, but the function that we're going to talk about today is the one at the top, the state reporting process, because that's a big opportunity for civil society organizations to get involved and press their governments to change. But keep in mind that there are other parts of these treaty-based mechanisms. There are other things that these independent experts do on the committees they serve on. And another thing we'll touch on briefly is the one in the middle, which is general comments. So we'll touch on that in just a moment. So as part of the state reporting procedure, there is a cycle of reviews. And this is, again, what a country has opted into. They have decided, yes, we agree to this treaty, and part of the treaty provisions that they've agreed to is to go through this reporting process. And it's kind of like a sort of, there's a self-audit that the countries do, and then the independent experts do their own audit of the performance of the country under its obligations under the particular treaty. So the first step in that process is that the state party, meaning the country that ratified the treaty, submits a report. And that's its sort of self-audit to say, here's what we're doing, here's what we've done to implement what the treaty requires, and here's where we're having some struggles, here's where we're trying to make more progress, et cetera. Some countries just paint a really rosy picture of themselves, while others are more frank and honest in terms of disclosing where they're having issues. At the second stage of the process is when the committee sends the state party a list of issues. And that's the committee really trying to narrow the scope of issues, because the treaty language is quite broad. And so the treaty body experts will look at that state party report and say, okay, here's what we want more information about. Here's where we're particularly concerned, or we want to talk more about that. That's what we call the list of issues, or LOI. Then the state party has a chance to respond to that list of issues. They typically will respond in writing. And then after that response to the list of issues, the government sends a delegation to Geneva to meet in person with those treaty body experts, typically for a total of 6 hours. There will be back and forth Q&A with the government delegations. Sometimes the questions can be really hard hitting, really drilling down to try to get more, concrete information, examples, or explanations for decisions the government has made. And then soon thereafter, we're at step 5 now, a couple of weeks later, the committee will issue its concluding observations, including recommendations for what the government should do. So those concluding observations are really important to civil society, because they're sort of the official report card that the committee experts give the government. And we want to make sure that that report card covers the issues that we are concerned about. And then the committee may select some certain issues for more immediate follow-up, like within a year or 2 years, and will request a specific follow-up report on some of those key recommendations. There's supposed to be a written response for those. And then several years later, the cycle begins again. There's a state party report again, and so on and so forth. So civil society has a chance to get involved in this process at several different points, but the key documents that we want to influence are the list of issues At step 2, we want to make sure that whatever issues the experts choose include our issues that we care about. We want the committee experts to ask about things that we may have been asking our governments about. And we want to influence the concluding observations. And the best way we can influence that is by doing what all of you have volunteered to do, which is to help provide information to the committee. We want to provide on the ground information to show them what is actually going on, maybe where the state party report is ignoring things or painting too rosy a picture or just not being accurate. Or maybe it's just a topic that's absent from the state party report. So we want to put that information in front of the experts so that they'll include those topics in the list of issues, so they'll ask the right questions. And then we also want to put information before the committee before that constructive dialogue happens in Geneva, so that they, again, once they've told us what their issues are that they're concerned about, so that they will have more information to really hold the government's feet to the fire, to press them, and then ultimately to have good recommendations that will help advance civil society's efforts to, in this case, abolish the death penalty or limit the use of the death penalty or improve conditions of detention for people on death row, for example. So that's the standard reporting procedure. And that applies to most countries. There is what's called a simplified reporting procedure that a lot of countries are now participating in. And it basically just skips the initial step of the state party submitting a report. So it starts out with the committee sending that list of issues prior, and they call it a list of issues prior to reporting because they're skipping the initial report stage. The committee sends that list of issues right away. And then the government's written replies to the list of issues, those count as the state party report. So the state government doesn't have to go through every article of the treaty to show it's complying with everything. The committee just says, here's what we want to see, show us what you have, tell us, respond to these questions. And it just sort of expedites the process in that regard. But we still, same as with the standard reporting procedure, we want to influence what goes into the list of issues prior to reporting in this case, and what happens in the constructive dialogue and goes into those concluding observations and recommendations. So it's fairly similar in both cases. So you may be thinking, well, what is our project and which one are we doing? Are we doing simplified or are we doing the regular procedure? So I created this graph, and I hope this gives you a sense of what an awesome team of attorneys you all are. We're doing 14 different reports on the death penalty issues, all due in January, and we have several different firms that have volunteered to do this. So I'm really thankful to all of you for doing this volunteering. And you'll see that for the list of issues prior to reporting, the only country where that expedited system is applicable is Trinidad and Tobago, and that's an Eversheds team. All of the other teams are working either on a list of issues report or they're working on that alternative report. There's already a list of issues or list of issues prior to reporting, and we're getting closer to the actual review period. So those are what we call alternative reports, and I'll give you more details on that later. But hopefully you've found your firm and your country on that list. If not, send me an email and we'll try to get things sorted out. I know we may have some people in attendance from Thomson Reuters, and they're working on a universal periodic review report, which is for the Human Rights Council. That's something a lot of the principles apply, but it's not a treaty-based mechanism. So if you're from Thomson Reuters and a little bit confused, don't worry, there will be plenty of relevance for you. So as I mentioned, Trinidad and Tobago, that's the Eversheds team working on that country. We'll be doing the simplified reporting procedure at the list of issues prior to reporting stage. And for everyone else, we're part of the standard reporting procedure, either getting ready for a list of issues to be published or getting ready for that constructive dialogue and suggesting recommendations and providing concrete information at that later stage in the review cycle. So our audience, and that's always important for lawyers to keep in mind, who's our audience for our written product that we're doing? And our main audience are the treaty body experts. These are usually law professors doing this as kind of a side gig that they don't get paid for, but is generally reviewed as prestigious and important. They are experts in what the treaty says, what the treaty means, but they're not experts in a particular country. So that's where we add value, is providing them with credible information about what's happening on the ground, what the state of affairs is in the particular country they're getting ready to review. So that's our main target audience. We also find that our partner organizations like to use these reports for advocacy with the general public. So that's sort of a secondary audience. And another secondary audience is the government of the state under review. A lot of governments will read these civil society reports to say, what are they saying about us? What are they saying is actually happening on the ground? And sometimes in a more confrontational way to say, okay, now we need to really go and rebut what civil society is saying when we meet with the treaty body experts, but sometimes really as a way to learn, okay, this is actually how civil society is perceiving what's happening on the ground. So that's important to keep in mind as you're doing your drafting, but our primary audience are experts who already know international human rights law. They know what these human rights, what human rights standards say. They just don't necessarily know what's happening in the particular country that you're writing this report on. And that's where we provide a great service to them, or that's where all of you are helping us provide a great service to them by giving them that information. So we'll start first by talking about list of issues reports. There's a lot of similarities to the types of reports that you're going to be working on. But the committee, as I mentioned, publishes a list of issues, which helps focus its upcoming review. And our goal as civil society organizations is to ensure that our issues are included in the list of issues. Now, we don't typically get everything we ask for, but we do want to raise awareness of the committee experts about issues so that they will be curious about them and include them in that list of issues. The key documents that you're going to be looking at for doing the list of issues reports are, first of all, the treaty, of course. What does the treaty say? And usually that's for your own background so that you can kind of frame the issues in your mind. Again, we don't need to quote treaty language at the treaty body experts. They know what the treaty says. At most, it'll be a reference to a particular paragraph in the treaty, and the treaty body experts will know exactly what that paragraph says. We don't need to go into detail there. We will also look at, because this is a cyclical process, we'll also look at the committee's concluding observations from the last review that country had, because those sort of set the stage for the next cycle of the review. So that's a really important document to look at, is those concluding observations and recommendations that the committee made last time around, and I'll give you some tips about how to find that document. Then there may be some follow-up reporting from the last review as well that might be relevant. Now that's, sometimes because the treaty body experts choose particular topics for follow-up review, they might not have selected topics that are relevant to the reporting that we're doing, but it's worth taking a look to see whether there's anything of interest there. And then, of course, if there's a state party report, that's also a key document because you want to look at what the government is saying to be able to be responsive to it in the report that you're drafting. Now, if in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, there's no state party report because that's a prior to reporting type of issue, there's no state party report to look at. But in other cases, in all the other cases, there should be a state party report to take a look at. And it's usually a really long document, so you can just do a quick skim of it to see if there are any relevant issues that are referenced. And we don't need to quote that at length. That's already in front of the treaty body experts. We just want to use that to kind of frame our responses. So that document is an important document to take a look at. And then another important consideration as you're doing those reports is what's the look back period? What's the relevant time period for the report that you're writing? And it's typically the look back period starts at the date of the previous concluding observations, because the committee already considered what happened prior to that. So that's kind of your starting date, roughly, more or less, the date of the previous concluding observations, or in the off chance that this is the first time the country has been through this review process because they just recently ratified the treaty, then it's the date of ratification. That's the time when the treaty terms take effect, is when the country ratified that treaty. So that's our relevant look back period for the list of issues report. And we have a template for you to use, and I will work with your pro bono coordinators to get that template into your hands. But I do want you to use that template, and the template kind of explains how to set forth, the different issues. In all cases for these death penalty reports, you'll want to have a section that just gives the basic facts and figures about the death penalty in the country. When was the last execution? What types of crimes are eligible for the death penalty? How many people are on death row, if we know that? Just basic information about the death penalty will be the first section of every report, just to get the committee experts grounded on what is the status of the death penalty in this particular country. Alternative reports. These are the reports that happen later in the cycle. And depending on what's happened prior to that part of the cycle, there may be more or less work for you and your team to do. So this is, as I mentioned, the committee has an in-person constructive dialogue with the government of the state under review. That happens in Geneva. And then a few weeks after that constructive dialogue, the committee publishes its concluding observations and recommendations. And our goal at this stage is to ensure that our issues are included in that constructive dialogue. The committee experts are asking questions about those topics, and that our issues are included in the concluding observations, and that we have really good recommendations coming from the committee experts that will help advance our human rights goals in the country. So the key documents that we're looking at for this one, and I see Teresa is there as well. Thank you. Yes. Hopefully she'll help me with keeping track of all the attendees. So we have key documents, including the treaty, of course, as was the case before, and then the concluding observations and follow-up reporting from the last review, which is the same situation for the list of issues, the state party report, if there is one, and then what happened in the list of issues is also a key document for us. And then any state party response to the list of issues will also be a key document. So we're farther along in the process, so we have a few more documents to consider when we're doing these alternative reports. The look back period depends on the context. It could be the previous concluding observations or the date of ratification of the treaty, or if we or our partner organizations submitted a list of issues report to the same treaty body on the same country, then it's just the date we submitted that report, because we've already given the treaty body experts information and it's just more of an update based on what we submitted before, what our partner organizations submitted before. So it depends on the context. We don't want to repeat any information we've already given to the experts that are getting ready for this review. We can sort of cross-reference those previous reports, but if we don't have a previous report in this cycle, then we will look back to the same time period that we would look back for the list of issues report. And when I get information to your pro bono coordinators, I'll let you know whether there was a previous report for this particular treaty body, for your particular treaty body and country. We also have a separate template for these reports. And again, it's a relatively simple format. We give you some guidance in terms of how to do citations and how to structure the report. Oftentimes for the alternative reports, the way you want to structure it is kind of a call and response guided by the structure of the list of issues. So if the list of issues has a couple of paragraphs that are relevant to our report, we'll organize our report. Paragraph 1, here's what we have to say. Paragraph 2, here's what we have to say. So we'll let the committee experts guide how our report should be structured, because oftentimes the committee experts will literally structure their 6 hours in accordance with that list of issues document. So they'll break it up into pieces. Different experts will take different paragraphs. And so we will make it as easy as possible for them to use our information during that review by organizing ourselves by the paragraphs that the committee experts have chosen. Now, if you have topics you want to talk about that weren't included in the list of issues, we can still talk about them, but we'll include them as sort of separate sections in the report. But it's fair game to talk about things that aren't in the list of issues. It's just if we can have a hook to the list of issues, it will increase our chances that the committee experts will talk about it in the constructive dialogue and in their recommendations. So now we're going to go through 10 steps to writing a treaty body report, which is what all of you have volunteered to do. And for this purpose, these are 10 steps that we use also with our civil society partners. So some of these steps or tips are more or less applicable to pro bono teams like yourselves who are working on these reports. But I'll take you through this so you can also see the perspective of our partner organizations as well. As an overview of the process, the first 4 steps are setting the stage, then the middle steps are planning and gathering information, and then the final steps are implementation. And then we'll talk about some best practices and things to avoid in your report writing. So the first step you want to do, or that our partners want to do, is identify your expertise. You look at our issues, our partner organizations' issues, and our advocacy goals. So with the death penalty, obviously our ultimate goal is for every country to abolish the death penalty, but there might be narrower goals as well. There might be specific issues we want to zero in on. And we've recorded a 1-hour training that is kind of an issue spotting exercise for death penalty issues, because you might think, well, like, we just want them to abolish the death penalty. But you also should know that international human rights standards say that if a country is going to have the death penalty, it has to be limited to the most serious crimes. So one thing we often talk about in our reports is whether the country does in fact limit its use of the death penalty to the most serious crimes, which human rights experts have defined as crimes that involve an intentional killing committed by the person who's potentially going to be sentenced to death. So things like the felony murder rule, it would not be would not be in compliance to sentence somebody to death under the felony murder rule, which some states in the United States do allow a person to be sentenced to death if they did not pull the trigger and did not intentionally commit a killing. So that violates international human rights standards. A lot of countries have the death penalty for drug-related offenses where nobody is killed at all. So those are topics to talk about. We would also talk about, in this context, conditions of detention for people who are under sentence of death. So looking at what those conditions are, do they have adequate access to food and nutrition, clean water, what are the hygiene standards in detention, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of different issues, and your focus will depend on what the treaty is that you're focusing on. So if you're focusing on, if your report is for the Committee Against Torture, you're going to focus on those detention conditions, whether torture is used to extract confessions, to sentence someone to death, and whether the means of execution amounts to torture as well. So those might be your areas of focus there. Whereas if your report is to the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, you're going to focus on, does the country have women on death row? If so, what crimes were they sentenced to death for, if we can find that information? And are there any gender issues in the criminal legal system that are of concern? So in the crime most women are sentenced to death for around the world is murder, and oftentimes it's for murder of an intimate partner. And what we know in most countries, including many jurisdictions in the United States, is that there's a context of intimate partner violence when a woman commits murder against an intimate partner. And we also know that in a lot of jurisdictions, the self-defense, legal defense for murder is applicable only if there's an imminent risk that the person is going to be harmed or killed. Only then can she invoke self-defense as a defense. She can't invoke that defense if she has been horribly abused by her intimate partner for a decade. And unless she can show that at the moment she exerted lethal force against her partner, she was at imminent risk of being killed or seriously harmed, then she doesn't have that defense available to her. So that's a gender issue that we would talk about in our reports to the CEDAW committee, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, probably less relevant to the other treaty bodies, for example. So those are sort of figuring out what your issues are that you're going to talk about and what your goals are. And then identifying allies. So we are kind of helping you out with identifying your allies because we're reaching out to our World Coalition Against the Death Penalty members and other allies to figure out whether there's anyone for you to collaborate with. Now, for some countries, we have active members and we have information to share with you from them. And in others, we don't. And so in that case, you're going to be relying on what we call desk research. So you're going to figure out what you can learn. Even though we don't have anyone in the country, you're going to do your best to track down information and include it in the report. But if we can get you in contact with a coalition member that's in the country or has some expertise, we will try to do so. We'll try to put you in touch with them so that hopefully they can provide you with some information or some guidance. And we do find that there is power in numbers, that the treaty body experts really have a lot of respect for reports that come not from a solo organization, but from coalitions, including the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, but also from organizations that are based in the country being reviewed. So that is the next step is identifying the rights. So digging through your particular treaty, whether it's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which would be applicable to the Egypt Frederickson and the Zambia teams, or the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Committee Against Torture. Look at their particular treaties and see what articles may be relevant. So for economic, social, and cultural rights, we're probably going to be focusing more on, for example, the right to food and health for people who are under sentence of death, or at issues of poverty as they relate to people who are charged with capital crimes, for example, and whether they have access to legal counsel that's sufficient, or whether there are issues of discrimination based on socioeconomic status within the criminal legal system. So it all depends on what particular treaty your team is working on. And then review the treaty body's process. So look at what's happened so far. Those are the documents I talked about earlier. So get yourself up to date on the procedural history of that particular review cycle. And then clarify your role. We, with our partner organizations, can hopefully provide on-the-ground information, do desk research that's relevant, do some analysis, and provide some other information, whatever we can find, to shed more light on the issues for the treaty body experts, because they don't have the time or expertise to really know everything that's going on in a particular country when they're getting ready for these reviews. Then we set our goals. For the list of issues, we want to make sure that the list of issues has questions and requests for information about our topics. And for all of our death penalty reports, we always want demographic information about people under sentence of death. That's something a lot of countries don't have transparent information about. So we always want to have in our report a request or a suggestion that the committee ask for demographic information about people under sentence of death, the crimes they were convicted of, their age, gender, racial, ethnic background, how long they've been detained, and you might find some other things that you think would be useful to get that information about. But that's also always really useful for our civil society organizations to get the official word on what the government is saying about how many people are under sentence of death. But also, you're going to ask, try to push for other content in that list of issues related to the issues you're focusing on. Then you'll have other goals about the committee's in-person review with the government's delegation. You want to make sure that the committee experts are asking questions during that review, that they have good information in their concluding observations and recommendations that will help advance our goals of promoting human rights in the country being reviewed. And to the extent we have a partner organization in the country, we want to consult with them early in the process about their priorities. We can sit at our desk and we can imagine, well, yes, of course, the country should abolish the death penalty. And that, of course, is something we want to ensure that all the treaty bodies recommend. But they might have some good ideas about other more incremental recommendations that would really help them with their work, or that could really help to, move closer to abolition, even if they don't think their government will actually abolish the death penalty within the next cycle. Then, of course, implementing your work plan, connecting the information you've gathered and connecting the goals that you and our partner organizations have set for the process, gathering that information with credible and relevant sources. We give you some tips for that in the template, and then taking into account the relevant look back period. And also keep in mind that we do use these reports beyond the UN review. We use them for advocacy and awareness raising as well. So, in some cases, we may include information in a report that might not be core to what the treaty body experts want, but it may have some additional value to keep in that report regardless. Then, of course, it's writing the report, which all of you lawyers are very good at. Set up your writing team, take that information, and incorporate the proposed questions or recommendations that you came up with in step 6, and avoiding abusive language. I'll get all of you some examples of our report so you can kind of get a sense for what the tone is. And this usually isn't a problem for lawyers because we're used to writing for courts and the like, and we know that we shouldn't get nasty in our written submissions. The same is true with these types of reports. It's more a caution to our partner organizations who might not have that type of background and expertise in legal writing. And then we finalize and submit reports. We have the treaty bodies have set deadlines we need to comply with. And ideally, we'll get stakeholder input before we submit the reports. And it says before you submit, I will do all the submissions. My colleagues and I at the Advocates for Human Rights will actually submit the reports, but we do need to build in time for the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty to validate these reports so that we can include them as a co-author on the report. And if we have a partner organization in the country, we also need to give them time to provide their input on the report. And then we do advocacy. So we do advocacy in the United Nations review. The committee has closed door briefings with civil society before that review happens. And then we do advocacy for implementation of the recommendations. If the committee makes recommendations on our issues, we do advocacy around that with the media and with the government. And we do advocacy to promote longer term social justice. We use that report as a tool for education and outreach as well. So some best practices and things to avoid in your treaty body reports. Framing each issue. So use your recommendations, your ultimate goal, what your key recommendations or questions are, to frame your arguments and organize your report. So use that to figure out where you want to focus attention and information is what those key recommendations are that you want to come out of the process, and let that sort of guide what type of content you include in the report. Another way to frame that's really helpful is to have sort of what seems like a call and response. Here's what the committee recommended during the last review, or here's what the committee asked for in its list of issues. Here's what the government's position is. Here's what the government said in its report or in its response to the list of issues, or here's what the law says based on, in response to what the committee recommended or asked. And then here's what's really going on. And that here's what's really going on is going to be the heart of this report, is to say, here's just a little setup about what the committee said, what the government said, and then here's the truth. Here's what we have found through our desk research, through talking to partners, from what our partners have done for fact finding on the ground. Here's what's actually happening. And that's where you're really going to be adding value to the process. Examples can be really helpful to highlight problems like gaps in the law, barriers to implementation of what might seem like a good law. So you can get those sometimes from mainstream media, from credible media sources. They may have a story about a particular case, and you can use that in your report. Even if you don't have statistics, these examples or case studies can really be helpful for the treaty body experts to understand what's happening on the ground. Please footnote all sources, including interviews if you do an interview with a partner, and information you receive via email. And please, for my sake, please don't use IBIDs or SUPRAs, because sometimes we need to do some reorganization of the report, and it can be really complicated if I have reorganized something and then I look at the footnotes and now I know now there's an IBID that has moved astray and is no longer associated with the source that it was referencing. So please just copy and paste full source citations for each footnote, and put a footnote after each sentence that has any substantive information, except for like topic paragraphs or topic executive summaries or topic sentences. Those don't need footnotes, but everything else should have a footnote if it has some sort of a substantive claim to it. Also, avoid lengthy procedural history. I think looking at those procedural documents is important for you and for a little bit of framing of the issues we present, but you don't need to go into a lot of detail because those documents are already in front of the committee experts. You should also avoid, I see a question about footnote citations. The templates give you some guidance in terms of citations. So most of your sources are the kind of sources that aren't easy to find in the Blue Book. So you can follow what's in our template. Otherwise, please just give complete information in your citations. If you don't follow Blue Book, that's not the end of the world, because I don't think our audience really cares, but we do want complete information. And for any UN documents, the important piece there is to cite paragraph numbers, not page numbers, because UN documents exist in multiple languages, and so the page numbers may change, but the paragraph numbers do not. So do try to follow the examples we give in the template for your citations. And if there's no example in the template, choose a citation format if it's Blue Book or if it's something else, just something that gives complete information for the reader. Other things to avoid. You don't need to have any lengthy discussion of the substantive particular rights. Remember, your audience, they already know that, and they're going to be annoyed if we're lecturing them about what it means to have, what the right to a fair trial is, because the treaty body experts know what a fair trial is. They just don't know whether trials in the particular country are fair. Avoid lengthy legal analysis. Really, the emphasis in your reports is going to be on the facts rather than analysis of what the law says, unless there's been an important legal judgment in the country or something that you need to give some analysis of and how that plays out on the ground. Again, it's not going to have the tone of a legal brief. You're not writing to persuade a judge as to what the law says or is. It's really more informative, providing information and sort of making the case for proposed recommendations or proposed questions. And avoid vague recommendations as well. We'll talk about that in just a moment. How to find the treaty body document. So I'm going to give you some screenshots here to help you navigate, and we're going to use the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women as an example, but you should know what your particular treaty body is. And they're all pretty similarly formatted. So if you go to the main webpage for the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, it looks something like this. And if you scroll down, you'll see sessions. And these upcoming sessions are the ones that we are preparing the reports for, the sessions that are happening in February, March of 2023. And this is also important because you'll see in the cover page of the template, you need to put the session number. And so this is where you get the session number, quite simple. And the pre-sessional working group is the part of the session where the committee experts are doing the list of issues. So those are two different things. The session itself, that's the 84th session, that's for the actual review of the countries. And for this committee, that's the Bahrain, Mauritania, and Tunisia reports that we're doing. The other ones, the pre-sessional working group, that's for Kuwait, Malaysia, Oman, South Korea, and Sri Lanka. I've got these all straight. So once you get to the sessions, you can click on the relevant session and you'll come to a page that looks like this. So this is that 84th session where Bahrain, Mauritania, and Tunisia are being reviewed. And you'll see there's a little flag of Bahrain and you'll see where it says consideration of state reports. That gives you all of the relevant documents for the committee's review of Bahrain, including the list of issues that already exist, the government's reply to the list of issues, the state party report, and then any reports that have already been submitted by civil society organizations. You just click those plus marks and you'll have access to all of those documents if they exist. Then how do you get the documents from the previous review? So this is for the current cycle. You also, though, need to go back to the previous cycle and look at those concluding observations from the previous cycle. So again, if you go back to the main webpage for the treaty body, you'll find a section on the webpage that says state parties reporting, and you'll find a link to the country-specific information overview. So if you click that link, it will take you to a drop-down menu and you just select your country from that drop-down menu. And then it gives you, voila, all of the different human rights treaties that that particular country has ratified. And I just did Bahrain as an example. You'll see the ratification dates over on the right-hand side, and then you'll see all the different treaties. And here we're focusing on the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And if you click that plus mark next to CEDAW, what you'll see is a list of the different cycles that the country has gone through. So the reporting cycle we're currently on is the 4th reporting cycle for 2023, but we want to go back and look at the previous cycle, the 3rd cycle, to find those concluding observations. So if we click the plus for the 3rd cycle and scroll down, we'll see concluding observations. When we go over to the right and view document, that's how you find the concluding observations from the previous cycle. So that hopefully will help you navigate to the documents you need. You may also want to take a look to see whether there are word limits or page limits or other rules, just to make sure. In some cases, you won't find this information because it's not posted, but in most cases, if you go back to that main session page, there will be an information note from the Secretariat of the treaty body that says participation by non-governmental organizations or something similar. And if you click view that document, it will tell you what the deadlines are for the committee. It will tell you if they have any word limits, et cetera. Usually we're not brushing up against the word limits, so it's not a concern. But if you're thinking, oh, this report is actually turning out to be really long, you may want to take a look and make sure we're not getting into trouble with our word limits. The committee experts also issue something called general comments or general recommendations. And usually we want you to take a look at these just for your own background reading to see if there's something that's relevant. Because what these are the experts on the treaty body showing connections between what the treaty says and general human rights violations on the ground. So a simple example of this is the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights elaborated on the right to food that's established in their particular treaty. And there's no mention of the right to water in that treaty. So they wrote a general comment to say, water is included in the right to food, even though water doesn't have any nutritive value, water is part of the right to food. And so they gave sort of an explanation. So that's probably not going to be relevant for any of the reports that you're doing, and we don't quote these back, but it's helpful to get a bit of perspective on how the committee may look at some issues. So how do you find these general comments and recommendations? If you go to the main webpage again, you'll find general comments and you can click the link for See All. And this is for, again, the CEDAW committee. They had most recently a general recommendation on the rights of Indigenous women and girls, probably not relevant for our report, and a general recommendation on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration, also probably not relevant for a report on the death penalty. But you can take a look and scroll through the other recent general recommendations to see whether there's anything relevant. Probably not for the CDOC committee, but worth just taking a quick look. For the Human Rights Committee, and that's the Egypt Fredrickson and Zambia Deckert teams, the Human Rights Committee did issue in 2019 a general comment on the right to life under the convention. And so that talk has a big section about the death penalty and would be worth taking a closer look just so that you get in the same frame of mind as the committee experts with respect to that. Some general principles, SMART recommendations. If you're doing a list of issues report, you don't need to include any recommendations at all because the committee experts aren't in recommendation mode yet. But for the teams working on alternative reports, you may want to make sure that recommendations that you're suggesting are SMART. And you may have heard of this SMART acronym before. We'll go into a little bit of detail about that. But do remember your audience. They're experts. They have time and space to go into a bit of detail, and they're issuing the recommendations in writing. So you can have sort of a little bit wonkier recommendations that are a little bit more nuanced than just abolish the death penalty. So keep that in mind as you're crafting your recommendations, and make sure as you're writing, and this applies to the list of issues reports and to the alternative reports, make sure you're presenting a solution or a recommendation or a question to address each issue or problem you mentioned. So to the extent that your report identifies an issue or a problem or presents some information, make sure at the end of the report where you're presenting suggested questions or suggested recommendations, make sure that there's a connection there. In both directions. Make sure that you've presented information that justifies the question or the recommendation, and make sure to the extent you've presented information, it can be tied to a suggested question or a suggested recommendation. And SMART recommendations, you've probably encountered this acronym before. We want recommendations that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And some people have a little bit different nuances of what words to use there. But we want things that are concrete and actionable, not vague things like make improvements on the conditions of detention on death row. What specifically do you mean there? Working with partner organizations, just a little bit here. And I did want to, this graph is the same as before, but it includes the internal deadlines that we've set for our teams. And I raised this here because for Egypt, for example, you'll see both teams have two different deadlines. Our partner organization for the Egypt report is Reprieve, based in the United Kingdom, and they're a larger organization that they have a few layers of bureaucracy they need to go through before they can validate the report. So they'd like to see a draft earlier in the process by January 13th. Or I think that's the Friday, and I need to get the report to them on Monday. So I gave myself a weekend to revise that report to get that to them so that they can go jump through their bureaucratic hoops. But we do want to make sure that if we have a partner organization, they get a chance to review that report in a timely way. And that may vary from organization to organization. So for the Kenya team, our partner organizations just want to see a draft before it gets submitted. They may have some comments and all of that, but they're not interested in being sort of heavily involved in the process. I suspect that our partner organization in Malaysia will be more involved in the process throughout. So they'll want more information there. We do have a partner organization in Trinidad and Tobago that probably just wants to see a draft at the end, but they might also have some information to share if you reach out to them. So I'll put you in touch. I'll put that team in touch. We may have people who can provide some assistance on Sri Lanka. We definitely have partner organizations focusing on Bahrain, Mauritania, and Tunisia. So I'll put you in touch with them. Zambia, I'm hoping we'll have a partner organization for you as well. But for the others, I don't think we do. So in each case, it will sort of vary how the partner organization wants to or chooses to interact with you. So don't take offense if you don't really hear from them. I'll do those email introductions, and then you can reach out and you can say, hey, could we have a 30-minute call to talk through what you're seeing on the ground, what you see as the most important issues to bring to this particular committee. That's a really great way to break the ice if you can get them to do that. And you can also ask them to send you information if they've had recent reports that they've published, or if they find credible news reports that they can send you to. It's also a great way if you're doing desk research and you find something and you're like, I'm not sure whether this is a credible source. It's like it's a blog post, but it's written by a law professor. You can shoot that link over to the partner organization. Say, hey, is this credible? Should I be relying on this, or is there something else I should be relying on for this particular piece of information? So use those partner organizations as kind of a way to help fact check the research that you're doing as well. All right, so I think that's it in terms of tips for working with partners. You have my contact information up above. Email is probably a better way to reach out to me than telephone because I'm not often in the office. I will also get you a link to our chapter on advocacy at the United Nations for human rights in Human Rights Tools for a Changing World that gives you a little more written information about the treaty body system and how to engage with it. But I think I will wrap up there, and we have 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I guess before I stop sharing my screen, in terms of logistics, if you are sort of the team lead for a particular country, or if you want to be the team lead to reach out to me, feel free to just send me an email to say, hey, I'm on the Bahrain team. And then I can reply to that email or reply all to that email and just give you any relevant other documents or information that I want to give your particular team. So feel free to shoot me those emails today and I'll respond in that way. If I don't hear from your team, because I understand not everyone could attend, then I will just send it to your pro bono coordinator or whoever I have contact information from your firm. I'll get it to them that way. But that's probably the easiest way. Oh, and Nathan's one of my colleagues, put a link to that chapter on advocacy at the United Nations in the chat. So you have that there if you want to get started before you get an email from me. I will also send you links to examples of reports that were submitted. I know that's really helpful for a lot of attorneys to see examples of reports that we've done to these particular treaty bodies as well. So I'll get you some of those examples as well. So now I will stop sharing my screen and I can answer some questions, and feel free to put questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and take the stage, please do. I'm seeing I have one question that was messaged to me privately. Are there any positive changes you've seen in recent years regarding the death penalty? And yes, we've had great positive changes. Zambia is one of the countries we're really excited to be reporting on because their president has committed to abolishing the death penalty. And we think that there's a bill in the works in Parliament. And we've heard from the president that if he gets that bill on his desk, he will sign that bill and the country will ratify, will have abolished the death penalty. That could happen in the next few months. And it's really exciting in this case. You may say, well, then why do we need to report to the United Nations? Having these reports to the United Nations and having these UN reviews is a way to sort of light a fire under the government, because they love to come to Geneva and talk about great things, talk about positive things that have happened. And sometimes this is the deadline they need to get things going. So we're really optimistic about Zambia, and we want to make sure that that report that we're submitting about Zambia says nice things about they've made good progress. They're making, they've made these commitments and all of that. And they just need these committee experts to put that extra bit of pressure on them to commit. And sometimes they come to Geneva saying, okay, we just passed the bill, we just signed the bill, and so on. So that's another sort of a really exciting way to see things happen. And then I'm seeing another question in the chat. Is it helpful to make comparisons to other countries? So in terms of these treaty body reviews, it can be helpful, and I'll give you an example. In some contexts, like I think it's Tunisia, if I'm remembering, or no, it's Tanzania, sorry, another T country in Africa. Tanzania, I think, isn't actively executing people right now, but it has more crimes eligible for the death penalty than I think any other country in Africa. So that kind of comparison is helpful to include, even if it's just in passing, to give some context. So we do want to say all the crimes that Tanzania has the death penalty for, but we also want to say this is more than any other country on the continent of Africa in terms of number of crimes. So those types of comparisons to show that the country is an outlier can be really helpful. But other types of comparisons that are like, Morocco has this law, Tunisia has a similar law to what Morocco has. That's probably less relevant for the treaty body experts, because when they're doing these reviews, their focus is on that particular country. So unless there's a comparison that shows how the country is an outlier or a leader in some regards, then we probably don't do comparisons to other countries, unless if you can see a justification for it, then, go ahead and include it in the report if you think it's justified, and I'll take a look and I can make that judgment call. Other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak or put it in the chat.
Hi, Amy. This is Kara
Hey.
from the Kenya team.
Yeah.
I just had a question. So I guess one of the things that you had sent me was the Kenya sort of report that had been written earlier this year for the Committee on Torture.
Yep.
And so I was wondering, sort of like, obviously my committee is different, and so the lens through which we're looking at things is different, but some of the data and the information seems to be exactly the same. Like in this death penalty, like in this report, they had a section on like legal aid and like how that like plays into the death penalty. And the first finding from the previous committee, or the second finding from the previous committee on cultural social, had the second thing they talk about is legal aid in the country. And so how much should we assume that they have any access to that, or should it be something that like that's sort of a situation where you can cut and paste because they wouldn't have ever seen the other committee's reports?
Right. So and I'll say to all of the teams, if this applies, if you're in a situation like Kara and the Kenya team where the Advocates for Human Rights did a report earlier this year on the same country, but for a different treaty body, I'll get a Word version of that report to your team so that you have easy access to it. And the answer is feel free to copy and paste, because yes, technically these experts do have access to what the other treaty bodies had. It's all published on their websites. We don't want to assume, though, that they're going to go digging around on the page of another treaty body. So we liberally copy and paste from our earlier reports on the same country to a different body. And that's perfectly fine to self-plagiarize. It's fair game. That's why I sent you that report, is to have at it. Feel free to copy and paste entire sections if that makes sense. But just make sure, as you said, you're viewing it through a different lens, through the lens of what that committee is doing. So you'll want to frame it again in terms of what this particular committee has said, has asked about in the list of issues, or said in the previous concluding observation. So the substantive information may be identical. You're just framing leading into it in a slightly different way.
Okay, great.
Other questions?
Ja, ik kijk even.
I just put my email address in the chat as well, in case people missed it from when it was up on the screen.
Ons best aan doen om de URL-ritjes zo goed mogelijk verdeeld te krijgen.
I'm hearing some talking in the background from Carolyn Voss, but I think it's just an inadvertent not muting rather than a question. If it is a question, it's very faint and I'm having a hard time hearing it. Yes, and another reminder, if you are interested in getting CLE credit, we need to keep track of attendance. So please do put your name in the chat if you haven't already, and that'll be part of the recording. So we'll have a list of credit. And do remember, we're applying only for credit for Minnesota, but you may check with your jurisdiction if it's not Minnesota to see if they would recognize Minnesota's CLE credits. All right, if I'm not hearing any additional questions, so we're at 1 minute to the hour. I really do want to close by thanking all of you for volunteering and being part of the process. This is a lot of reports to do in a very short period of time. So it's a team effort, as you can see, and do maintain open lines of communication with me as questions arise. I'm happy to have a call with your team or with you individually, or respond to emails. Know that I'm here. And do also keep in mind that while each of your teams is doing just one report, I'm in charge of all 14. So please have some patience with me if I'm not responding right away. And do be mindful of the deadlines as well, because while, the deadlines may seem, well, it's not due until a week later. I do need to get those reports turned around really quickly and sent off to the World Coalition partners for validation as well. So I'd appreciate your adherence to the deadlines as to the extent that you're capable. We'll also get this PowerPoint sent out to your team leads or to your pro bono coordinators as well if you would like to have the written version in front of you. Thank you all for your time and attention, and good luck with the process, and look for emails coming from me later today or tomorrow. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.